show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Mark Montgomery. Mark, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely. We're really excited to chat with you, especially someone new to the career field with not much of a background. No, I'm joking. Mark's background is actually incredible. When me and Nikki were bringing him on, we were like, what the hell do we even ask this guy? He's done so much. He has such an incredible background and so many different unique roles and capacities. So we're really excited to chat with you, Mark. But for folks that don't know you or haven't seen you anywhere quite yet, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I was a career naval officer. I did about 32 years commanding destroyers, destroyer squadron, and a carrier strike group. I retired in 2017 as a rear admiral and went to work immediately for Senator John McCain. Worked for him for a couple of years till he passed as the policy director on the Senate Armed Services Committee, which was incredibly enlightening. Probably got more done in a few months of work there than in 32 years in the Navy in terms of correcting Department of Defense policy or aligning things effectively. Then Senator King, who'd been on the Armed Services Committee, had become chairman of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, along with Representative Mike Gallagher, who was on the House Armed Services Committee and who I'd worked with. And the two of them asked me to run the Cyberspace Solarium Commission for them. And so I did that for about 3 years until we sunsetted the commission about a year ago. And what we did there was, pass a bunch of legislation. I know we'll talk about this in a second. And then we're now running, Senator King, Representative Gallagher, and I are running an NGO that tries to keep working on the Cyber Solarium issues called Cyber Solarium 2.0. It's housed here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where I also run their Cyber Center on Technology and Innovation, and I'm a senior fellow that works a lot in their Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel defense issues.
Yeah, as I mentioned, you have quite the background. One thing I've been wondering, you've made this transition into cybersecurity, and you're really articulate on the topic when it comes to cybersecurity and national security and things like that. How was that transition moving from your previous Navy role, which I imagine as part of a strike group and such wasn't necessarily cyber focused? How did that transition come about, and how was that experience for you?
Well, that's a great question, because I didn't mention two of my other jobs as an admiral. One was as head of our deputy director of plans, policy, and U.S. European Command. And then the other was as director of operations in U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. And both those jobs, the cyber element, either the cyber planning or cyber execution element, came under my, were people that worked for me. And so as a result, I had to work, between 2010 and 2017, is reasonably involved in the evolution of the force employment side of Cyber Command, how we use those forces forward, how we interact with the geographic command commanders. And then I was one of the many people disappointed in our inability to actually take our cyber tools and use them to plan and execute missions against an adversary, whether it be Russia or China, because of the kind of limitations and challenges. So I was pretty well involved in the defense end of cyber. And then when I was on the Armed Services Committee, as Senator McCain, he was ill, when people left, we didn't hire replacements because they wouldn't necessarily be kept by the next chairman. So we had to start distributing jobs. And I became the cyber PSM, professional staff member, for about a year, which was about 11 months longer than I thought when I said I'd do it. But it turned out to be really educational, and the kind of people who I worked with later on the Cybersecurity Solarium Commission. I became extremely knowledgeable through oversight of the kind of things that we would take a look at in the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And that's one thing about being a Hill staffer, particularly on a committee like the Armed Services Committee of the Senate or House, is that you become extremely, the Department of Defense and you become very close, and you're able to do quite a bit of oversight and learn a lot about the systems and have good understanding.
Yeah, based on your just incredible experience and breadth and depth of experience across cybersecurity, usually we ask this question last, but I think it is totally appropriate to ask this up front. based on your experience and sort of where our conversation is going to go. But what does cyber resiliency mean to you?
I'm glad you asked that and asked it up front, because this is, in fact, if you saw the release, like I said, in the last 24 hours or so of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, they had 10 things for Taiwan, and one of them is to improve cyber resiliency, and I think it comes from a recommendation I gave them during testimony about 3 weeks ago. I gave them, like, I call it a baker's dozen, like 13 recommendations. A lot of them were about munitions or deployment cycles or training with the Taiwan forces. But then a big chunk, the last third, were about cyber, and they were exactly on this issue of cyber resilience. So to me, cyber resilience is about three things. It's about your ability to maintain. This is in a national security mode, and that's where I come from. It's about your ability to maintain your to conduct military mobility. In other words, can I move my forces, my supplies, my equipment, my fuel, my ammo from point A to point B to carry out the national security demand? So this is about your rail systems, your highway system, your ports, your air control systems. And look, the military is fantastic. They have this thing called mission assurance, where they go study a base and they're like, hey, does the base have 2 power generators? Yes. Does the base have 2 independent water supplies? Yes. Does the base have this? Does the base have that? Have we Kevlar'd the electrical sub power station so someone can't shoot it? Yes. Check, check, check. Then, so the stuff on the base is doing great, but you're, Fort Hood, and you're going to get this tank to Korea or to Europe. It drives off this, like, beautiful, cyber protected area, leaves the base gate, and it's like going into the cyber Mad Max Thunderdome, right? Because now you're out in the private sector. Who knows who's taking care of cybersecurity here? It's not the Department of Defense. Who's doing oversight? Who owns and operates it? It's not the federal government. And then it goes on a truck, a train, a plane, or a ship to get to and that whole experience is, Mad Max Thunderdome, right? Anyone could go at you, anyone could do this. And look, if I were the Chinese or Russians and I was trying to send a signal to the United States, this is not the war you want to be in. I think this is really more China than Russia. I would put malware in that critical infrastructure. I would note that's what Typhoon Volt announced yesterday, right? That we've caught the Chinese doing this again. Microsoft did somewhat of a big reveal on that. So to me, that's the first chunk, that military mobility, and that's China could do that, or an adversary could do that before during a crisis buildup to say, is this really what you want to do? We can do more. Or would they do it, during a crisis buildup to really hiccup you? And look, they know where everything's moving. Transcom generally runs almost all its flow planning on unclassified systems. So they must be penetrated. All right. The second part of cyber resilience is protecting your national critical infrastructure. Your national critical infrastructure it supports the national security I just mentioned. So and it also supports your economic productivity, kind of important in the United States, and it supports which includes your tools of economic statecraft, how you impose cost on an adversary with economic tools like sanctions or currency manipulations, things like that, or blocking off accounts, right? And then third, it provides public health and safety. So we're talking about financial services, power, water, pipelines, hospitals. It goes on and on. Food and agriculture. It goes on and on and on. And by the way, that same stuff from mobility, the transport, the rail, ports, and aircraft. So you got to protect that. This is what I'm just describing there is almost wholly owned by the private sector or state and local governments, not the federal government. That middle chunk, from soup to nuts. And that's where, we've probably taken the most risk in terms of just allowing, the market, allowing those utilities or those companies to make their own risk management decisions about cybersecurity and resilience. And then the third group of this is disinformation. So you got military mobility, national infrastructure, and now disinformation. And this is about the fact, and we see snippets of it particularly around elections, where foreign disinformation can easily get into our systems. This is usually cyber enabled. It delivers a message, like, it might deliver a message like President Tsai has resigned, at the beginning of power strikes. And then you have a whole discussion. The President Tsai she's the president of Taiwan, just resigned, after the first set of missile strikes, or Taiwan's capitulated, or, who's this war being fought for? Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Boeing, or for the American national interest? These kind of like, or anti-Chinese sentiment, right? Anti-Chinese American sentiment, which would be wholly inappropriate. All these kind of disinformation messages. And look, the Chinese and Russians aren't stupid. They know how to take a kernel of truth or amplify a seed of doubt with this disinformation, how to use our social media to spread it, and then sit back and examine it, and watch the tomfoolery, right? So you have to have resilience across all three of those like lines of effort. And, we don't have the inherent cyber defense capacity to handle any one of those three, much less those three. And so I really worry about this. To me, that's what cyber resilience is. To me, is the protection of those three and the stability in all three of those areas.
Yeah, I want to ask a quick follow-up question on that topic. You talked a lot about munitions and ports and critical infrastructure, and being owned by the private sector and stuff. I think when we think about the resiliency of our society, and we think of typical warfare, obviously it's very physical and kinetic. As with munitions and physical infrastructure and things like that. But we're seeing increasingly a case to make cyber essentially a domain of warfare, or at least recognize it as such. Many argue we're already there. We've seen authors like, that published the book, The Fifth Domain, for example. Why do you think it's taken us so long to consider cyber or the digital domain part of, warfare and critical infrastructure, despite its pervasiveness? As you touched on, like everything we do is cyber enabled or software driven, for example. Why do you think it's taking us so long to recognize and kind of address this now?
Well, look, in fact, The Fifth Domain's co-author, Richard Clark, was my boss at the NSC in 1998 to 2001. And he and I, we worked, we were the counterterrorism shop who had like a side hustle about we had a side hustle on critical infrastructure and cyber. Like, here's like a 10% level of effort. That's what it was in 1998, 10% of like two people. But, when we looked at it then, we wrote, if you were to read the National Infrastructure Assurance Plan we wrote in 2000 and read the National Cybersecurity Strategy in 2023, a lot of the issues are the same. A lot of we've got to do this, we've got to do that. So I guess when you're asking why are we like this, because for 23 years, we've used a voluntary approach. When look, cyber warfare and cyber resilience are different than any other kind of mission area. If you think about undersea warfare, submarines and tank warfare and fighter jets, the government owns all the assets. The government decides how you force generate them. The government decides how you force employ them. The government's in charge. And so if we want to be good at it, you put more, you get the gas tank of the government, you put some more money in for undersea warfare, more submarines come out. That actually doesn't work, but in most areas it works. Fighter jets, it works, things like that. And out they go. Not cyber warfare. Cyber warfare is this unique thing, and not our critical infrastructure. Unlike authoritarian regimes, our federal government, as I said earlier, federal government may own 10 to 15% of what you consider national critical infrastructure. By the way, when Dick first said that number, 85% in 1999, I'm confident it was based on no mathematical proof. It was just his, Kentucky windage guess. It turns out over like 20 years, it's proven out to be reasonably true that somewhere between 82 and 85%, or 82 and 88%, this is not owned by the federal government, but either by state and local or private sector. But that stuff's owned by them. And look, it's a whole different thing. The government can't just put money in the top of the problem and expect something good to come out. Suddenly, the government doesn't have access to or control over all the information about that mission area, right? Because now it's owned by the private sectors, and the government doesn't make the security return on investment decisions, and that's the most important one. So you're asking me why we're here 20. Like if you told me 23 years ago, got a real problem with this Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile, and we hadn't fixed it after 23 years, I'd say I hope there are a lot of fired admirals and generals and secretaries of defenses. But and this is a completely different area. After 23 years of the government not being able to cajole the private sector into the right answer on what's the return on investment of for cybersecurity, it's a disappointment. And look, the proof that I'm right on this is if you look back 5 years ago, 18 years into this problem, which critical infrastructures were secure? Big banks and financial services. Why were big banks secure? Because big banks were the target of cyber malicious activity for the first 15 years of cyber malicious activity. I forget which of the criminals said, "Why do you rob a bank? Because that's where the money is." But that's what, why and so what did we end up with? We ended up with 7 or 8 banks in America that spend nearly $1 billion each on cybersecurity, which is more than like 150 countries. Each individual bank is spending more than like 150 countries out of 192 on cybersecurity. So look, where the return on investment was clear, financial services, banking, the investment was made. Where it wasn't clear, the investment wasn't. Now, thank God for ransomware. I'm the only guy that thinks that, but thank God for ransomware, because it's teaching everybody, you better take cybersecurity. Because what ransomware do? Ransomware monetized data. It said, your data has value to you or to someone else. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to monetize it into a ransom payment. And I'm going to monetize it by either shutting off your business operations so that you can't charge people. I think that's Colonial. I mean, the dirty secret on Colonial isn't that they couldn't pump fuel and aviation fuel down to Atlanta Hartsfield. It's that they didn't want to because they couldn't have built them properly. And then the second one is I actually attack your field operations. Now you really can't pump. That would be even bigger, right? Or I grab the PII of your customer database information. We've seen that a lot. That's what happens a lot with the school districts. And then fourth, I grab, and that's what happens a lot with hospitals too. And then fourth, I grab I could grab like incriminating emails, the back and forth with the general counsel about all the bad actor cases you have in your workforce. And that's a little bit of Sony. I mean, it wasn't ransomware there, but they intentionally released that to do reputational damage to companies. So my point on this is we monetize data now. So 23 years later, I think we're on the cusp of giving a crap. And so I think you're starting to see companies, there's this rheostat, and for younger kids, a rheostat is a way to turn, it's the volume control knob if you're really confused. All right. So, that rheostat can say security on one end. That means security is high, but access is inefficient. Or you can turn it the other way where security is low, but everyone can move around the network. And companies have always said it at low security and high access, although, by the way, low cost. And now they're having to crank that back up. And if they're not cranking it back up, their cyber insurance companies tell them to crank it back up to get their premiums lower. And so, we're starting to see that change. And you're finally starting to see the government say, possibly, that we need to, you're seeing your government say that, hey, in the balance of regulation, incentivization, and collaboration, we've been overly reliant on collaboration and need to put a little bit more into regulation. And maybe for the poor, what I mean by the poor here, like water utilities that don't have 2 wood nickels to rub together, some incentivization.
I just love the analogy of the 2 wooden nickels rubbing together. I think that's hilarious. I did want to touch on one of the things you mentioned early on. You were talking about how we've sort of been talking about this for 25 years, right? Like we've still been seeing some of the same trends, some of the same concerns, things like that. I think identity and access management, right? We're talking about it as zero trust now, or IAM or ICAM, but we've been talking about password management, account management, RBAC for years, and we're still talking about it just sort of in a different way. Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit more because I wasn't as familiar either. And so anyone that's not familiar with the Cyberspace Solarium Commission or CSC, can you talk a little bit about, some of the mission, what you're working on, maybe what you're working on in the future, or what we might be seeing coming out?
Sure. So the commission was set up in the National Defense, I think the fiscal year 19 fiscal year 19 National Defense Authorization Act. And it was done because, at this point, Senator McCain, he's not a big fan of commissions because it's kind of an acknowledgement that we couldn't do our oversight properly in the legislature. We need to get in some outside experts, but he wasn't opposed to them, not a fan of them. But what happened here is you had just a series of events. First and foremost, the Chinese theft of OPM, Office of Personnel Management records, about 24 million military and national security professionals records, including, Senator McCain's, that was pretty frustrating. And just the sign that, inside the federal government, we weren't doing even the bare minimum to protect data. The Sony, the attack by North Korea on Sony, where we wouldn't even attribute it to North Korea for several months, and then when we finally did, our punishment was we're going to indict 3 North Korean army officers. I mean, the next move for those guys is go to Pyongyang to get an award from Kim Jong-un. And let's be clear, there's no extradition treaty. They're not visiting the U.S. Judicial system anytime soon. So completely inadequate, slow, and pathetic response from McCain's point of view. And then finally, the Russian cyber-enabled information operations attack on our 2016 election. So those things came together. He said, "Look, we got to do something. So let's do a commission." But he was really smart. He said, "I'm gonna, all I want you to do right away is just tell me a good strategic approach to defending ourselves in cyberspace, because cyber." We were preventing big cyber threats, like Russia and China weren't taking down the electrical power grid, but there's a whole lot of stuff happening in the gray zone before what we call the use of force, where we would go do something about it, with a military or cyber or espionage capability. And so he says, how do we get that balance correct? Where less and less bad stuff's being done, because we're getting more and more interconnected. Things are not going to get better; they're going to get worse. So let's get ourselves better. And said, and most importantly, I want you to come back with legislative recommendations. Tell us what to do. And then to help out, he put 4 serving congressional members. Now, they were picked by their leaderships, but he said there'll be 4. It was Senator Angus King, independent caucus of the Democrats from Maine, Senator Ben Sasse, who was from Nebraska, and in fact brought this language to McCain to work on. Representative Jim Langevin, Democrat from Rhode Island, who was by far the most cyber savvy congressional leader we've had in the last 2 decades, period, full stop, no other discussion. And then Representative Mike Gallagher, a Republican, young Republican from Wisconsin, with good, strong national security bona fides. So the 4 of them were the members. King and Gallagher became the chairman just by dint of, it had to be one from each party, one from each chamber. And then the other thing McCain did, which was probably borderline not constitutional, was put 4 sitting members of the administration on it. So the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the head of the FBI, the Deputy National Intelligence, and the Deputy Homeland Security. And the beauty of that was you had, you understood exactly where the government was as you're trying to work through this. And you got inputs from the government like, hey, don't say banana there, say plantain, and things are going to go a lot easier, whatever it was. So we got together, we ran fast, right? 1 year, got the report done with recommendations, 82 recommendations initially. It's up about 100 now, 110 now, because we kept working. But 50 legislative recommendations right away. And we did a smart thing, and this probably came from a few of us coming from the Hill. We didn't just say, hey, connect A with B with C. We did that in an actual congressional language, like how you write a bill, so that you could hand it to the staffers. And a few things really benefited us. One, we had members, actual members, senators and representatives. 2, we had we knew how to write this legislation. 3, cybersecurity is a bipartisan issue, and the Congress had just asked for this a year before. when your commission takes 2, 3, 4 years, the people who asked for it have left or no longer, especially at the staff level. So they were ready to receive. So we really got a lot done the first year. And then since every year since, we come back. And over the last 6 years, cyber has gone from being like 4 or 5 things in the National Defense Authorization Act to 50 plus things every year, 40 to 50 plus. I mean, really significant changes in cyber, and we were able to play into that and get a lot of things in. But we've also used 4 or 5 other types of vehicles: appropriations bills, standalone bills, the infrastructure, bipartisan infrastructure act, things like that. So from my perspective, I think that we really, the commission was right group of people, those 4 members particularly, at the right time, looking at the right issue, and we're able to get a lot done. And we're not done. You ask what we're doing now is, as we sunset, you should sunset commissions. Commissions shouldn't go on and on. Some do. It's a mistake. But we still had we'd written more white papers come up in King, Gallagher, Langevin, and we had some other great commissioners, Tom Fanning, the head of Southern Company, Suzanne Spalding, Samantha Ravitch, Chris Inglis, who became the first national cyber director. They gave us other ideas. And so we've been now we're going through basically each sector by sector, and saying, what do we need to do here to get it right? We've looked at, other issues like, how should sector risk management agencies run? How do you do continuity of the economy planning? We've looked at space as a sector already. We've looked at water as a sector already. We're looking at healthcare. We're looking at aviation. And then we're also kind of taking a look at some military things. How do you build better partner capacity? Because we had a ton of military organizations that got in all the first year. They've all been making, I think, a good impact. And now as we look at it, there's either corrective guidance we need. So we're looking at, partner capacity building. How do we do it better? How do we make our allies whose infrastructure we need to work on in a contingency or conflict? How do we make sure they're secure? And then finally, do we need a cyber force? How much longer are we going to experiment with a system with 5 services generating inconsistent, ill-resourced, differentially paid? You can tell where I'm leaning on this, or do we shift to a cyber force? And so hopefully we'll get there pretty soon. So that's where we're at. We're working a lot of these issues, and we still get a lot of support. Chris Inglis has rejoined us. He retired as national cyber director after about 18 months or 20 months, and he came back. Most of my original staff have gone out. They work at National Cyber Director. They work at CISA. They work on the Hill. A few are in the private sector, but we're in a good position to continue to influence things. Then you hire in new young staff to kind of get them working it and get it going. Because we try to be like a system of getting people in who can get the experience of executive branch and legislative quickly, and then be of value to the government or the legislative branch or private sector going forward.
Yeah, you touched on so many great things there, and you kind of led, you touched on a lot of topics that, made it into the national cyber strategy. And I think it's kind of a testament to what you all did, because those themes and recommendations and topics are still being discussed in some of the most prominent, cyber dialogue underway right now in government. It does lead me into my next question to you. I recently saw some comments from you discussing, how cloud service providers are kind of, currently still not designated as critical infrastructure, despite their pervasiveness, used, widely by obviously private sector, but also intelligence community, Department of Defense, where I've done a lot of cloud security work myself over the last several years. And those comments are really similar to, comments we've seen from the Office of the National Cyber Director, the acting cyber director, I should say. I'm curious, given the pervasiveness of cloud service providers, and how reliant we are on them for everything in society at this point, basically, when you look at private and public sector, how have they avoided being designated as critical infrastructure? And is that happenstance, or is that intentional? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, there's a few thoughts before I go right into the cloud one. First, I do want to say that I'm happy that the National Cybersecurity Strategy looks a little bit like our March 20 report. I would acknowledge that the 2 lead writers, Harry Kreska and Matt Farron, were both on our staff and went over to the NCD. So at a minimum, the tone and tenor would have been the same, because their writing style came through in both documents. But also it was run, Rob Kanacki did the oversight of it, who, the other Fifth Domain actor, and someone who I think was very consistent with our thinking on the commission side. Again, no surprises there. I also want to comment on, You said acting national cyber director Campbell Walden. The administration has done a lot of great things. They've erred a couple times. One of them was being very slow to appoint a national cyber director, and it really took, Senator King and Representative Gallagher, really Senator King, leaning into them, saying things repeatedly publicly at press events to cause the press to finally ask the president what's going on, and then the president immediately nominated Chris Inglis. And at the same time, King was communicating Chris Inglis to the administration, and he got nominated, and the government was so much better for it. They're making the same mistake again now at Campbell Walden. She is supremely qualified for this job. Most importantly, she was the principal deputy for 15 months or 12 months under Chris. She shepherded the national cybersecurity strategy through. She's written the implementation plan. She's been on the Hill. The Hill likes her. Bipartisan likes her. It is obvious she's right. She has a good mix of government and private sector. She is obviously the right candidate. And the longer they wait on this, the worse, the more challenging they make, the country's job of implementing the national cybersecurity strategy. So, they've done a ton of great things at the NSC, the NCD, CISA, NSA, all the acronyms have done great. But the White House PPO, another acronym, the Personnel Office, is dorking this up. And I think Inglis told them he was retiring back in November, December of last year. So I think they've had 6+ months to not screw this up, but they've screwed it up. They need to nominate her now. You can't guarantee anything. I would be shocked if it took a day over 2 months to get her through committee and through the full House. She'd be that well received as a nominee. And the administration, handicaps itself with this short-sighted thinking. Okay, cloud service provider. Why aren't they critical infrastructure? Well, 2 reasons. One, they didn't exist the last time we did this, right? Which was 2013 with the PPD 21. This is one of the many flaws of not updating PPD 21 every 2 to 3 years, and instead it's been 10 years. Just think about this. This is the document about how we handle emerging technology and national security issues inside the administration. We'll update that every 10 years, right? I mean, it's completely illogical. They should be updated every 2 or 3 years. So the number one reason is they weren't listed. The number 2 reason is they would prefer that you didn't exactly accumulate them together in a sector that would look like a utility that might eventually involve regulation. Like, I'm going to assume for a moment that Microsoft, Amazon, and Google's government affairs people spend most of their time all day like undermining the other 2. Why not? But if you were to say the word regulation, you would suddenly see like the 3 of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I mean, throw Oracle in. Now you got 4 horsemen of the apocalypse charging at you in unison, locked arms to say, we shall not be regulated, right? So, so you're asking me why? I'll give you 2 reasons. 1, they didn't exist when we last thought about it. 2, they'd prefer you didn't, and it turns out they're powerful. So are they going to be regulated? I think so. We may not use the word regulation, but they are a utility. Look, some of the best advice you can get if you're a small or medium-sized business is find yourself an MSP or a CSP or a cybersecurity as a service, provider to reduce your costs and increase your security. Now, look, that doesn't obviate you as a small or medium-sized business from doing good cyber hygiene and following all the rules and doing everything you're told, but it sure prevents this cybersecurity workforce issue from impacting you because you're buying into someone who has the workforce they need. It gives you access to talent management, incident response management. In theory, it gives you access to, a good patching system where if you select the right level of automated delivery, you'll be in a better position. I really think it can help you. Well, if we're going to say the way to get more secure for lots of companies and lots of smaller utilities is to get into these clouds, then we better make darn sure that rheostat in the cloud is set. Now, look, that rheostat can move. If you're a defense industrial base company building, the only black powder, factory in America, you better have pretty damn high cybersecurity, right? So that you don't get, malware in your machine tooling, right? the vast majority of which is automated now on systems. If you're a public utility, maybe you're at the 60% mark. If you're Vic's dry cleaner, you can be at 10%. But we have to have these standards. What's the floor for what you do? And that's going to, if you want to call them standards or regulation, we need them. I think if these four big ones, bigs, were really, it's three or four, depending on how you count them, big cloud service providers were to get together and say, here's the floor we're going to set for these types of services consistent with the CRG stuff, the CISOs, like recommendations for maturity and scalability on industry, and a recognition of PPG 21. What is a national critical infrastructure? They could set something up, in cahoots with CISO, probably, who's if they're anywhere, they're in the IT sector, which is the Sector Risk Management Agency, CISO. So they could work with CISO, not as a regulator, but to set a standard that they adhere to, do some kind of third-party checks to prove it. I mean, all those companies own the biggest third-party check companies you could. I think Google's got Mandiant. I mean, they can work. They can figure this out. You could do that, and you could really have an improved cybersecurity nationwide. That's my future dream, right? Where and we could do this without kind of formal regulation, most likely. We could do it by an agreement on cybersecurity standards, run through probably a joint, and run and maybe third-party monitored by a joint industry government organization funded by both, that looks at them and studies the securities, just studies those decisions they're making, examines incoming threats, says, hey, we better tweak the rheostat 0.1 degrees based on this, that kind of stuff. I really think that's the solution. I hope we can get there. If not, I think eventually the government's going to put on the bare knuckle gloves and we're going to have some regulation. And I don't think that's good for real regulation with the capital R, not comfortable regulation. And I just think we could probably get there through this kind of mix of that is a true mix I described of regulation, incentivization, and collaboration, to get you right.
Yeah, I like that answer. And, you led right into my next question for you is, earlier you touched on, you made a comment about being 23 years later, and we're finally starting to get our act together to some extent on certain topics. Obviously CISO recently released their secure by design, secure by default guidance for software suppliers. And I wrote an article talking about how this concept of, building security in versus bolting it on had been around since the Ware report over 50 years ago now. In that national cyber strategy, it talks about shifting market forces and the concept of software liability and safe harbor too, on the flip side. I'm curious, it kind of builds on your previous comment about regulation. How do you think this shift of market forces is likely to play out? And then if it does, what would safe harbor look like in that scenario too?
So I agree with you, by the way. You can't go all the way back to where you go back to the Marsh report about, Marsh Commission about 33 years ago as well. I mean, we've talked about this issue that is very expensive to add this on later. Building security in, from the ground up makes sense. And it hasn't always had this terminology. I mean, we're good at this, things like zero trust, secure by design. They're redescribing something that we thought about years before. But I think that the other issue you're getting at is kind of a little bit of the liability involved in this, which is, I'll get right into that and say, look, I think it was helpful at the beginning of software development to kind of, because it was entrepreneurial, it was beginning to let things move around and not treat them like a kid's toy where, hey, if you have a break off piece of this size, you can't do that. And if you do, we'll sue you. And if you do, if it turns out that you built it to poor enough a quality that a child swallowed it, that family can sue you, that kind of thing. I think we're getting to that point in software now where you are liable. This industry's been around long enough. It's reached that maturity that it needs to be treated like industry. And it needs to be treated, when you think about big things like utilities, and they have to meet standards. And if they don't meet those standards, they have to be liable. And I think what we're getting at now is, look, we wrote it slightly, I don't want to say more gracefully, but more we were much in the Cyber Commission. We were very explicitly about, look, if you're continuing to support a software, you're putting out changes to it, you have to continue to patch it. And if you know about a vulnerability and you don't patch it, and that vulnerability gets exploited, someone can sue you. And there's a lot of software like that now, where as a new version is released by that same company, they begin to slow down, stop patching vulnerabilities, and that's not acceptable. That's just not acceptable. You have to, in my mind, you have to be held accountable for that now. Now, this is a much broader. They imply a much broader level of accountability in the national cybersecurity strategy. I'm not sure they're wrong. I think we were trying to kind of get that first foot in the door, and I'll just tell you, we had no success. So, I mean, there were no bites on that. In fact, there's Tim Starks from the Washington Post comes back to me, hey, which one of these? I think Eric Geller did this at Politico too when he was at Politico. Which one of these ones that are red that are you think have no chance of getting done? Why is that? And the one on this was always easy. It's because industry blocks this one pretty quickly. And they have enough friends in Congress who are concerned about opening up liability chains.
Yeah, that's it's a really interesting topic. And I imagine even in the next couple of years, we'll probably see, I would think, more and more information coming out around that too. I am curious, for my last question for you, because I wanted to take a little bit of a different angle, because I see a lot from legislation and the executive order and things that we've been talking about. There's a lot of technical information in there. There's a lot about zero trust, software supply chain security, things like that, right? I'm talking about SBOMs a lot, but I don't see a ton of legislature or really anything in the executive order around the human element. How do we protect our users? And not even just that, there's a lot out there right now about the cybersecurity workforce, whether that's bringing people in or people leaving because of burnout or frustration or, sort of name your item. But I'm curious if you think that we will ever see anything around that in either an executive order or from some other legislature, or if you foresee anyone else sort of looking into this in other ways as well.
Good. So let me tackle that two ways. First, and you're absolutely right. This is probably one of the, when we look at our, we had 6 lines of effort. Workforce was in one of them. And when I look at my lines of effort, we did great on the department. This is the commission. We did great on strengthening DoD. We did pretty good on reorganizing the government. We did pretty good on the international collaboration and norms by getting the Cyber Diplomacy Act passed and the Ambassador Fick, the cyber leader at State Department, in. But we did medium to poor on resilience. I've talked about the things that are still remaining there, but in the ecosystem, and we did okay on the building partner on the public-private collaboration. Again, kind of a low, a C or C or D. The place where we had an F was on the cyber ecosystem. Part of it was that liability issue we just brought up was in there, but another one, the workforce is in there, as is this last one, which is, I think we need a cyber victim. We've been pushing some legislation. We're not getting anywhere on it right now. We're going to try again this year on a cyber victim assistance center. One of the problems we have right now is when Aunt Betty or Uncle Fred, gets tricked by the Nigerian prince and the $10,000, heading the other way. It's when he's subjected to some kind of cyber or information operations crime like this, there's no look. He's not going to get she or he's not going to get restitution, but they sometimes need help on how to prevent further loss, like your PII has been, your personal identification information has been compromised. They might be able to get some money back, highly unlikely. And how do you prevent this from happening again? We don't have that. We need a cyber victim assistance center, and the police stations can't. There's 10,000, whatever it is, law enforcement operations around the United States. They don't have this kind of cybercrime victim assistance. Some of the very big ones do, like New York City or something. But then again, they have so many complainants coming into them. They're overwhelmed as well. So we want to set something up with an NGO. We've had this problem before in the United States with missing and exploited children. and we set up a cyber victim, a missing and exploited children center at Department of Justice that then helps establish this non-government organization that kind of runs the broader issue and helps in locations and things like that. To me, that's the great model. We're going to try to push something like that through again. We need that. That'll help. That's a part of what you're talking about. Now, on the workforce, there has been a lot of legislation. It tends to be about the federal cybersecurity workforce. But you're absolutely right, because let's describe this current situation. I don't know how many jobs are free. I know there's this heat map, that tells you 752,000. Chris English used to always give an exact number. I knew one thing, that number was wrong. I didn't know what the right number was, and it's not jamming on him, but what wasn't wrong was the idea that about 1/3 of the jobs were free. Well, here's the problem. If you're running an organization, and here's the trick on cybersecurity, is that cybersecurity is the one organization where you really need, especially inside the federal government, to be retrained every 18 to 24 months. You need to go back for a little bit. So if you're at 2/3 manning all the time, and everyone's working harder, everyone's pretty unhappy, and then finally, no one's going to that specialized, recurring, persistent training you need. So you end up with a underperforming, unhappy, poorly trained workforce. And that is not where we need to be. That does not describe excellence, right? So you've really got to get at this. So I was pushing hard on the federal government. We've done 2 white papers here. We've put forward a bunch of legislation. Kemba's team is actually working on a national cybersecurity workforce strategy. Should be out in the next couple months. They took it well beyond what I was thinking. And, it's a risk, because if they just concentrated on federal, I think they could get a lot done. But they're opening the aperture. They're looking at the national cyber workforce, how we educate and train, how you improve the cyber hygiene, for lack of better terminology, or personal data care, how you private, or data care, if you want to use Ron Gula's terminology, which is probably a little better. How do you do that? Those things that you're going to see that from this strategy coming out. Now, look, those last 2 I mentioned, the non-federal ones, the federal government can't control everything. They're a medium to small size player in those. Whereas in the federal workforce, they're a very large, i.e. the only player, right? So, we'll see what happens. I'm looking forward to their strategy coming out. In other words, it's a little more visionary than I would have done, but that's okay. As long as they still block and tackle on the stuff they can get done in all the different areas, that'll be good. But that's how we have to address it. So you're about to see a little more movement on this, particularly on the federal, but even in some of the other areas, as we try to work down this problem. And I think the number one thing we can do to lower stress on the cybersecurity workforce is to have a properly sized cybersecurity workforce.
Yeah, I think that's it's a great point, right? To have the right people in place to reduce burnout, because that's one of the things that I think we're certainly starting to see and have seen. There's a lot of great research and information out there about burnout in the industry, but I think that's one of those things we'll continue to see people sort of roll out as cybersecurity continues to be a somewhat stressful and continuous learning environment for people. Well, I wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us today. I can't say how much I've already learned from our conversation. I wish we could talk to you for 5 hours, because I feel like we really could. We covered everything from, national cyber strategy to talking about defense and operations and everything, critical infrastructure and everything in between. So huge thank you, Mark, for joining us today.
Well, Chris and Nikki, thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure. And I've listened to your podcast. A bunch of my friends have been on your show before, and I think you really get at the challenging issues we're facing. So, luckily you're being supported by ransomware as well. We'll all, we'll keep the focus on this issue over the next few years, and hopefully you'll see some the improvements that I alluded to and that you've asked about during this discussion.
Awesome. Thanks again, Mark. And that's going to take us out for this week. We'll see everybody next week. Thank you.